Welcome to another episode of Tack Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleague Sumantra Maitra and a very special guest, Jarrett Stepman, a columnist at the Daily Signal. Today is Wednesday, April 2nd, the long awaited Liberation Day, when President Trump will impose new levies on U.S. trade partners. So we'll discuss tariffs and related matters. Then we'll talk about France, where populist leader Marine Le Pen was banned for 5 years from running for public office, which, if the ban sticks, would render her ineligible to run in France's 2027 presidential elections. We'll also discuss a recent New York Times article on America's deep and lethal partnership with Ukraine throughout the Russia Ukraine war. And we'll wrap up with a discussion of Trump's plans to retake the Panama Canal and some recent developments on that front. If we have time at some point, I'll ask Jarrett to give his general assessment of Trump's second term thus far. And before we dive in, I want to remind our listeners that there is a video version of this episode that you can watch on YouTube. We've got a loyal audience on our podcast apps, but we need to get those YouTube numbers up. So please subscribe to the American Conservative on YouTube, smash the like button, share with your friends, help us thwart the oppressive left wing algorithm. It's what Donald Trump would want you to do. I'll put it that way, or Thomas Massey, depending on who you prefer. But for tariffs, we still don't know what tariffs Trump is going to announce today. It seems like the administration is delaying the announcement until after the markets close for reasons that are perhaps obvious. Jared, I'm going to kick it to you first and just ask, what do you make of Trump's tariff policies so far? Are you for them, against them, somewhere in between? And how are you thinking of these expected Liberation Day tariffs?
Yeah, I suppose I'm a bit somewhere in between, although it's hard to be between things when you don't know exactly what those tariffs are going to look like. I know there's been proposals for just a broad 20% tariff across the board, which there is some reason to think that maybe that's the way to go. It does create, I think, a certain amount of certainty in these tariffs. There are a lot of countries now reacting to this, saying that they are going to potentially drop their own tariffs on the U.S. because we don't really live in a pure system of free trade globally. Of course, there are many tariffs that many of our competitors and rivals and many of our friends have on the United States too. That's something that President Donald Trump has brought up quite a bit, especially in terms of, let's say, Canada having a huge tariffs on dairy products and other things. So there was no real system of pure free trade before because it is an international system. That's sort of a little bit of folly that always has been. And I think that this is sort of in line with Trump's general policies of sort of nationalism. It's not just on this issue, it's about, controlling the US border, which has been a big part of this. I mean, a lot of his talk, certainly in his first term and now, has been, bringing jobs back home, and that's been a huge issue. Of course, the left and the sort of, the uniparty establishment has wanted to bring in a huge influx of cheap labor, and that's been a huge problem, for quite some time. I think Trump has made huge strides in that domain. But the economic policies need to go alongside that. And I think that's what's happening now with these trade policies. Now, one could say that could potentially cause some damage with especially allies. And that's, I guess, where I'd have concerns now, especially when you have countries like Japan and South Korea now talking about closer cooperation with China in opposing U.S. tariffs. That's where I guess I'd have some concerns. Now that hasn't necessarily come to fruition yet, but if the U.S. is going to have a broader global strategy, America First strategy, that's a potential cause for concern.
Yeah, I did see that someone from South Korea said that China kind of exaggerated the extent of cooperation that was discussed in that trilateral meeting. But I did see those headlines, and it does seem like those three countries are planning some sort of unified response. To your point, yeah, America has practiced a kind of unilateral free tradeism the last few decades, where we tend to have lower tariffs on our trade partners than they have on us. And Trump, in his State of the Union address, that wasn't actually a State of the Union, just the joint address, the address to Congress, he had said that today we were going to have reciprocal tariffs. So whatever a country tariffs us, that's what we're going to tariff them. And it seemed to already have some effects. I saw that Israel reduced or eliminated tariffs on America in anticipation of today's announcement. But some uncertainty has entered the picture in the last few weeks where people didn't know if that's actually what he was going to announce today, and it still remains to be seen. But Sumantra, what do you think about this whole issue?
Yeah, I think you covered it well. I think the question that comes to my mind is what is the ultimate purpose of any kind of political action, right? I mean, it needs to have a set amount of determined goals that you're, aspiring to achieve from this action that you're taking part. Tariffs is not a good or a bad thing. It's a neutral thing. You can use tariffs. You cannot use tariffs. That's a political choice. If you use tariffs, you are essentially, the more you use tariffs, the more you're incentivizing domestic audience, which also means like lower, choices. Um, and the lower tariffs you have greater choices. But on the other hand, you kind of hollow out the domestic manufacturing concepts. These are all, economic aspects of tariffs, and no one has any questions with that. My concern would be to the purpose of tariffs. There is this statement that we have talked about before. It's by Kenneth Walls. This sentence which he constantly uses, that power begs to be balanced. If you act as a revolutionary power, and if you put tariffs on every single country around the world, you cannot expect to influence them while not, at least in some form, giving them some kind of leverage, or some kind of, stake in your domestic governance. That it's an imperial system. Like it's the same thing that happened with the British Empire. For example, when Britain had an empire, it was promoting free trade within the imperial system, where you could get like dairy products from Australia and New Zealand. But also, given that you are having competition, local British farmers, for example, didn't compete with the Australian and New Zealand dairy products, right? So there are those questions are always there. Like if you have to have a bigger influence in the globe, then at some point in time you would lose some form of influence in your domestic politics, and that's a balance that people have to maintain. You mentioned the South Korea and Japan and China thing. Obviously, South Korea and Japan and China are structurally bound in a competition, so I have questions as to how much they will be able to come together and have joint tariffs against the US. But even if there are signs of some kind of hedging behavior in South Korea and Japan, that is not actually good for us, provided we are planning to have a competition with China in the Asia Pacific, and these are some of our greatest allies. Likewise, when it comes to Canada, of all the countries that I can think of having, a tariffs, I can totally imagine having tariffs on the European Union, because they absolutely fine American companies. They do not follow, as JD Vance mentioned in Munich, there is no joint values when it comes to the European unions. They're fining the biggest American tech companies, for example. They are domesticizing their defense industrial base. They're sidelining American companies from that. They are having tariffs on American products such as bourbon and stuff. They are having tariffs on various other things. So I can totally see having tariffs on European companies, because it's a it European Union acts as a united actor when it comes to tariffs, and they try and kind of like leverage all their individual transactional ideas with the US, and it with not going for bilateral topics, but they actually do tariffs on the United States as a whole. So I can imagine counter tariffs on that. Well, in Canada, for example, I mean, what is the point? Yes, Canada has some tariffs on us, and yes, but also it is so much entwined with the American, domestic market. I don't actually see it beneficial to any kind of American, product. Especially, it's probably going to hit consumers more if they have to buy some kind of Canadian milk or cheese or whatever comes from Canada in a higher price. So yes, there is a, a justifiable instinct for tariffs towards other countries. Reciprocal tariffs are especially important, but also you cannot have tariffs against every single country flat, while also expecting the entire grand strategy of the United States would have to change if that ever happens. A couple of things which I want to mention before I close off. One, while the Americans in the election wants to have a bigger manufacturing base, there is no unanimity as to what that manufacturing base would look like in real life, right? So does that manufacturing base means like the California tech industry, booming? Does that manufacturing base, looks like American farmers being subsidized? Does that manufacturing base looks like an autarky where people are paying an extremely high price to get products which are solely manufactured in America, even if those manufacturing costs are insurmountable? Like we don't really know a clarity as to what that view is. My personal opinion is Americans are not ready for an autarky, because autarky at the end of the day is really painful. And it's a reason why, like, people don't really want autarky. It's because it's economically proven to be painful to the consumers. And the second point is I don't really understand why the tariffs are being delayed till 4, to the point like why the Trump administration doesn't want to, see a market collapse, because it is going to have an effect on the market. I mean, that's how the market works. If tomorrow the stock exchange opens in the morning, we would see a crash. So it doesn't really matter. The consumers are going to. So if Trump has to mention that, look, we want tariffs, and we understand the pains that's going to come with it, but come on, we have to like be together. That's one thing. But I don't have any clarity on whether tariffs are being used as a negotiation tool, whether tariffs are being used as something which is strategic, whether tariffs are used as a completely different channel to reshape the entire the American economy that we have practiced for at least, if not 25, at least 50 years. I don't really have any clarity, so I'm willing to listen from you guys about that.
Well, I think the earlier tariffs that were on Canada and Mexico, or that were threatened against Canada and Mexico, those were basically being used as a tool of statecraft to elicit concessions, as we've talked about in previous episodes. It seems to me that these reciprocal tariffs, these planned reciprocal tariffs, are more about shoring up America's domestic manufacturing, maybe addressing trade imbalances. I think Trump also just has a general view that other countries need to kind of pay us back for like the security umbrella that we've extended over them since World War II. For listeners, I just want to say an autarky is basically just a self-sufficient society, right? When it was interesting, we were talking about balancing, and we were talking about Japan, South Korea, and China. It also seems like the EU and Canada are getting in on this kind of balancing act, and Trump has preemptively warned them about that, saying that if they, coordinate their response to these tariffs, he's going to put even stronger tariffs on them than he had planned on doing, which I found kind of interesting. So, Jarrett, I want to give you a chance to kind of talk about the what's good about tariffs, because Sumantra and I are the most regular, people on this podcast. Joseph Addington is also often on. All three of us happen to be a bit more anti-tariff than most people at TAC today, and then most people historically have been at TAC, which it was co-founded by Pat Buchanan, who was a who favored tariffs, and he supported them definitely. Can you talk about why conservatives often, this kind of Buchananite conservative often favors tariffs, and what are some good things that they can bring?
Yeah, it's interesting too when you talk about the long tradition of the Republican Party actually has been generally the more pro-tariff of the two parties. It's only a more recent phenomenon that there's kind of that lean into the free trade message. I mean, we talk about Republicans in the 19th century, including Trump's favorite president of the day, William McKinley, was sort of the grand, I mean, beyond Henry Clay, who was the very early proponent of protective tariffs. William McKinley in the late 19th century was a very strong proponent of tariffs. Interestingly, in his very, very last speech, before he got shot and killed in Buffalo, sort of made reference to a shift in U.S. policy, that the U.S. had secured itself as one of the great producer countries of the world, that we need to now expand our markets, which I think sort of gets to the pragmatism that needs to be involved in how we deal with a lot of trade policies. I mean, for me, I've always sort of been pragmatic about it. I think there are many who are sort of doctrinaire free traders on the right who simply see it as a matter of economics and pure dollars and cents. And I don't think that's ever really been the case. There's a really interesting piece actually in Compact Magazine called the thinker that sort of led to who was the proponent of protective tariffs. It's actually about a man named Henry Carey in the early 19th century. Talked about trade is not just something about pure dollars and cents, money going out and coming in, but about building communities and nations, and the trust that gets to not just having people be specialized in certain economic endeavors, so where a country becomes simply specialized in one thing or another, but as a comprehensive economy that this builds political communal trust in a nation. Now, even in his day, his ideas were controversial, but they were very much at the root of the Whig Party at the time, became the Republican Party. This would have been very common language for Abraham Lincoln, would have certainly been a proponent of protective tariffs, as the Republican Party was in those days. But the idea was to create strong markets within the United States. There are many things that are produced, need to be produced in the U.S. There was a lot of experience, especially in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, where certain items were simply not available, especially when you're in a warfare. The U.S. didn't produce, the colonies didn't produce enough gunpowder. They didn't produce guns. They had to get these from elsewhere, other countries, get it from France and allies. And of course, that's subject to attacks on the high seas, attacks on the things that you will need potentially if you are in a conflict. So being self-sufficient, I think is a big part of this. I think it's a big part of the sort of Trump transition right now, that the United States in the world that's developing is not self-sufficient. A lot of our allies aren't as well, especially in manufacturing. And then we simply need to reshift to make those things priorities in manufacturing. We've seen, I think, even, in the Ukraine-Russia war, a weak country like Russia can actually outproduce the United States and the EU in some very critical things that are necessary for war making. The United States on the eve of World War II was a tremendous, even coming through the Depression, was a tremendous self-sustaining economy that was able to turn that into military power. I think there's fear that while the U.S. and our allies are very strong financially in comparison, that some of those critical areas in manufacturing simply aren't there anymore. They don't exist, and they can't just come out of nowhere, especially if there is a serious conflict that develops. And I think that is a big concern. So I think there's a domestic concern about the loss of jobs and the loss of community in the United States, which was always part of Buchanan's message. But there's sort of a strategic concern too, which is there are great powers in the world like China, like Russia, especially China, that is an economic behemoth that is now cornered the market on a lot of materials that are necessary for a modern economy. And then any actual open conflict between these countries would be ultimately a catastrophe for the United States.
So I have one very short thing to add to that. I totally agree on tariffs on China, by the way. I think Jarrett made a very good point about warfare. Given that we are reaching an emergent multipolarity, it is totally understandable that we don't want our domestic manufacturing base to be controlled fundamentally by Chinese manufacturing. My question is not whether tariffs are good for China or the United States. My question are, why are we putting tariffs on all the countries at the same time, even the countries which could be probably our allies against the conflict, cold or hot, on China? That is my question is tactical, not
Yeah,
strategic.
I will respond to that in a little bit. In fact, some of the tariffs placed on some of the issue, especially with Mexico in particular, is that a lot of Chinese industries have actually used Mexico as a conduit to U.S. markets, that they've actually dominated it within Mexico itself, and that Mexico is now rethinking this because of those tariffs, because they know that this could potentially put them in open conflict with the United States. So, to a certain extent, I think that is because China now exerts so much power globally, that some of that pressure from the U.S. does push some of our even our allies to have to think about ultimately what direction they go in. Now, maybe they go in the direction of China and not the US, but I think a lot of countries have to ask themselves that question. Is it better just to deal with the United States or deal with China? So to a certain extent, maybe that the tariffs open that door where we understand now we're in just a multipolar world, and there you have to make certain choices about who you are dealing with. And I think that is part of it in this discussion. So that would be my response to that.
I would agree that the dawn of multipolarity is relevant here, especially if we're talking about reciprocal tariffs, because America, as the global hegemon, was, as I said, practicing this kind of unilateral free tradeism. In some ways as a favor to other countries, and for other reasons because some economists say that you should have low tariffs even against people who tariff you. But in any case, it seems like that era probably should be done now. Like we should rethink it. Now is a good time to rethink our trade policy. It is interesting that so many U.S. founders supported tariffs for some of the reasons that you were laying out, Jared. Even founders that are normally associated with international favoring international commerce, like Hamilton, thought that we needed tariffs to shore up, national supply, or to make sure that we are ourselves producing things that we need. But I think we need to move on to France, where a criminal court in Paris found Marine Le Pen guilty of embezzlement, specifically of diverting European Parliament funds to her own national party. The court sentenced her to 4 years in prison. Half of that was suspended, and it seems the other half she can serve under house arrest. It also fined her $100,000 and, most importantly, barred her from running for public office for 5 years. As I said earlier, that would make her ineligible for France's presidential election in 2027, and she was the front runner, the favorite to succeed Emmanuel Macron. That might not quite be the case, even though that's what the polls look like, because all these establishment parties tend to find a way to kind of, close ranks and keep parties like the National Rally out. But her odds were looking good. It seemed like she really had a chance of being the president this time. Her party has been gaining support. She's the face of that party and its leader. She can and she will appeal the decision, and it looks now like the Court of Appeals will deliver a verdict before the presidential election. All of this, of course, raises the question of lawfare, and it seems to further establish this undeniable pattern, undeniable in my view at least, of political establishments using lawfare and other anti democratic methods to kick populists off of ballots. Even some centrists and left wingers in France, to their credit, are saying that this sentence against Le Pen is unjust and an act of political persecution. I think their main left wing guy, what's his name, Jean Luc Mélenchon,
Sean, yeah.
he decried the decision and said like the French people should be electing their president, not these judges. So that was good to see. And some like left wing commentators globally have also criticized the court's ruling, which I was happy to see. So Mantra, I'm gonna throw it to you first. What do you make of this Le Pen situation?
Right. I mean, I took A1 in French when I was in my high school, so I don't really know if they have a French word for lawfare. If they did, you're absolutely right, Andrew. They probably would have understood what's actually happening anyway.
Hmm.
Again, something that the French has to learn for the from the Anglos. I hate to give it to them. Fundamentally, there are two things that's happening. One, the charges against Le Pen are absolute nonsense. Le Pen didn't take any money. Embezzlement is a catch-all term for these kind of things. But basically, what happened is like they have a certain amount of money that they get. Their aides are supposed to use that. Their aides use that in their way. And given like vicarious, the principle of vicarious liability applies in this case. So vicarious liability wise, Marine Le Pen was charged on embezzlement, and that is that. Uh, the the rhetoric that you're going to see on news media is like Marine Le Pen has taken money and has committed the charge of embezzlement. That's absolute nonsense. People need to know that she hasn't taken any money. It is purely because of vicarious liability. The second aspect is, again, this is not something that's new that's happening in France. They have been trying kind of like having a test run of this case in Romania. A very interesting thing that happens in European Union is a concept that a lot of European policymakers are loath to talk about. I had a meeting, I remember, with the former Hungarian Justice Minister, Judith Varga, and I asked her the same question. Like, there is a Latin phrase, there is a legal principle, nemo judex in causa sua. You cannot be the judge in your own court, right? That is a very common law, English common law principle. Uh, the meaning of that principle is like, if you are a party to a conflict, then you cannot also be the judge of that party, of that conflict. You cannot judge yourself, right? That's a common law principle. And I asked, Judith Varga, like, look, at the end of the day, any conflict, any judicial conflict that's happening in the European Union is going to a European court. For example, if you have a human rights issue that is being judged in a European court, it is quite obvious that the European Union is a party because of the European Union statutes on human rights. So how are you having the European Union as a party while your case is being judged in a European human rights court and still expect that you're going to win? It's the William Hague nonsense that, you can be a part of European Union, but not be ruled by the European Union. I have never seen in my life a situation where that has happened. I mean, one of the reasons why British people chose Brexit was because they realized that more than immigration, more than defense, more than anything else, British laws were not made in British Parliament anymore because it was being judged in a European Court of Human Rights. So unless that was severed, that link was severed, there was no independence. Most of the European countries are currently like facing the same case. There is another question to this, which you have probably read, all of you have read, several times in the last few years. Is like, you can be part of the European Union and slowly transform the European Union to a concentrated right-wing imperial project. European Union is a supranational organization. There has never been in human history a supranational organization which has not transformed itself to progressive means. It is very difficult. By definition, it would need to tamper down on centrifugal forces, in their opinion, in which case Marine Le Pen or this Romanian guy or Viktor Orban or whoever is opposed to the centralizing homogenous project of transforming, taking away power from local parliaments, taking away power from democratic projects to create this massive supranational technocratic organization. Now, if you are a European federalist, for example, or if you think that the European Union should be an empire, you probably would support that. You probably would think like, you know what, at the end of the day, regardless of how I sympathize with Marine Le Pen, this is helpful because this is creating a European Union as a strong, coherent, supranational imperial entity which, by the way, is going to be this massive global power taking over the United States, taking over China, throwing its weight around. But that again, I don't foresee a situation where that is happening. The moment it becomes a supranational organization, it's fairly certain that most of the reactionary forces, which are part of the European Union, are going to be tampered down. So in that way, this is not something which is new. As for Marine Le Pen appealing her case, she can. But again, just as any lawfare, the question is not about punishing Marine Le Pen. The question is essentially just disbarring her from standing. The moment you are an electoral threat to the current establishment of a country, you will have some chains thrown around you, just so much that you are still not like you're not in jail. You're still free to go walk around and campaign for your party's nominee, but your star power is gone. So if Marine Le Pen's party, the Front National, comes up with a new candidate, Marine Le Pen would still be able to walk around and campaign for him. But again, Le Pen's personal star power is going to be gone, and that is what the intended purpose of this thing is.
Yeah, and it seems like that successor would be Bardella, this very
Bordella.
young,
Yep.
charismatic, intelligent guy. He's only 29 years old, and it seems like he's the person who would be their presidential candidate if this ban on her running for political office sticks. The principle you articulated earlier about not being a judge in a case in which you're involved, that's relevant also in Brazil, which is another country that has barred a right populist, in this case, Bolsonaro, from running. Not even their full Supreme Court, but just this judicial panel banned him from running for office. And one, the head judge of that panel, I don't know the details, but he was sort of involved in the story because Bolsonaro's alleged anti-democratic plot involved that judge somehow. It was going to sideline him or remove him. I can't remember the details. Um, and then, yeah, you mentioned Romania, where Georgescu, I mean, that was an even more egregious example of this because Georgescu won his election and then they just did a mulligan. And they kind of just, they said that it was suspicious how popular he was on social media, especially TikTok. They said it looked inorganic. Probably Russia's involved, who could guess that they would blame Russia? In my opinion, that one was totally fabricated and the most egregious. The Le Pen case looks to me like just selective enforcement, which is also a violation of basic legal principles. Like maybe she did break this obscure law, but from what I've read, it sounds like a lot of people, a lot of politicians in the European Union have broken that law. Like funds that were supposed to be for aides at the European Parliament were kind of used for aides who are also involved in their national political organizing. No one cares in the other cases, but with Le Pen, it's a show me the man and I'll show you the crime kind of situation, as far as I could tell. But Jarrett, what do you think about all this?
Yeah, it seemed more similar to what they try to do to President Donald Trump in the U.S., ultimately unsuccessfully. I do think that in the US system, that was actually harder to pull off than in the European system. I think that the sort of liberal managerial state that exists there in the EU is far more powerful than it is in the US. It turned out to be a very bad strategy in the United States. It's interesting that it's being replicated elsewhere. I think it is because partially because of the different legal circumstances. It's easier to pull this off simply. I do wonder though that as this continues to happen over and over again, I think the assumption is that these populist forces will eventually die down and calm down. But it doesn't really seem like that. If anything, they seem to just be agitate people. I know in Romania they now have another candidate that's equally right wing that is now leading in the polls. I'm not sure. Maybe they'll ban him too. You can only go through so many people, and just keep banning them. I think Romania is perhaps their political system. I think it's not surprising that they're a little more haphazard in the way they do things. Nobody would assume that they're a particularly over the board country and how they do politics over there. Um, but I don't think it speaks well of how the political establishment is navigating these times in which, these proponents of liberal democracy seem neither liberal nor particularly democratic. That's part of their central plank as far as, this is why we have to fight Russia because it's an authoritarian country where democracy is fighting authoritarianism, especially from an American standpoint. This is why some of JD Vance's criticism, especially in Munich, really struck, especially an American audience. It's like, well, yeah, these people don't seem particularly democratic at all. Why are they giving us a lecture about democracy? I don't see that over there. If anything, things seem to actually be getting worse than they were in history, and I think that is a big thing. And maybe will continue to cause strain between Europe and the United States. Is there's this idea that we're sort of continents going different directions right now, have different value set. That Europe now kind of stands in for this sort of liberal global empire. The United States is actually starting to act like a nation within that global empire and is going its own way. And so I do think it's very interesting. They've copied the American lawfare playbook that didn't work in the United States. They've copied in Europe, maybe more successful, but they're also flirting with a lot of danger because there are a lot of these populist parties now in Europe that are extremely frustrated with, of course, the unlimited amount of immigration, of a lot of hostile foreigners basically in their countries, and going in a direction that seems increasingly authoritarian and imperial. Now, maybe this is the time they just basically become that imperial system, as Sumantra says. But at the same time, there are a lot of nations still that exist there in Europe that are deeply unhappy with the system that be, and a lot of countries that don't want to be part of that, especially in Eastern Europe. They have a very different set of circumstances. Poland, I mean, do they really want to be part of this kind of European empire dominated by Germany? Maybe not. There are certainly a lot of economic benefits to being a part of that. But there's a lot of negative downsides too, especially culturally. And I think that that is a huge issue now. And again, I think it will continue to rupture relations between Europe and the United States, seemingly two continents going totally different directions, at least at this moment.
Yeah, I think this is more likely to be successful in France than it was in America, in part because in America we just have more robust protections, against throwing candidates off the ballot. They tried to do it in Colorado, where this court just ruled that Trump, because in their view he tried to have an insurrection on January 6th, therefore he was ineligible under the Constitution. Obviously, that ended up not really working. You mentioned liberal democracy and kind of alluded to this liberalism, democracy conceptual pairing. And that's interesting because I think we should probably try to revive this distinction that is very apparent in the history of political philosophy, but less apparent today between liberalism and democracy. For most of human history, most of Western political thought, these two things were thought of as being very different, right?
Opposed to each other. Yep.
And today, because we have liberal democracy, and when people say the word democracy, they often kind of just insinuate liberal democracy. We see these things as being fused. And I think what we're seeing in the European Union right now is a kind of hyper liberalism, but a democratic deficit. And it's a hyper liberalism because, in their opposition to illiberal or perceived illiberal parties, the political establishment is employing anti liberal means to keep them out. It's kind of interesting, if you read like Carl Schmitt, this Nazi jurist, before he joined the Nazi Party, he wrote this book called The Concept of the Political, where he basically argued that a Republican system of government, a liberal constitutional republic, needs to not allow these dangerous right wing and left wing parties to enter into the mix. You have to use like authoritarian force to keep them out. And I don't know if Ursula von der Leyen has been reading her Carl Schmitt. I kind of doubt it, but we can see that same dynamic, taking place now. I don't want to be hyperbolic. It's obviously we're not talking about the Nazis. We're talking about a very different situation. But I think that that's kind of how they're looking at it. And I'm curious, Sumantra, do you think, if we're looking at the case in Romania and the case in France, and also we could talk about Germany because there's been a lot of steps taken against the Alternative for Deutschland party. What is their main beef with these right populist parties? Is it that they're immigration restrictionist? Is it that they're going to be soft on Russia? I kind of think it's the latter. But what do you think is the main reason that they're perceived to be so threatening in the EU?
So this is very good that you asked, and I would take your cue and start with a reference to Carl Schmitt. Like Carl Schmitt always said that it's the exception which determines the rule. If you are figuring out a theory, you have to take the counterfactual and see if the counterfactual is explaining the theory. If it doesn't, then your theory is not valid, right? So that's how. A very interesting experiment on that would be to see which kind of right-wing parties are currently very much in favor of the European Union and the European Union very much in favor of them, and what kind of right-wing parties. It has got nothing to do with immigration, by the way. It's got nothing to do with social conservatism. Poland's right-wing parties are extremely socially conservative. They're very anti-migrant, anti-migration. They're suddenly very, very fine. The European Union establishment is very fine with all of those people. Hungary, on the other hand, is not, because of their opposition to this conflict with Russia. Same with Romania. The traditional political parties, right-wing political parties who are also anti-migration, they have no problem with the European Union, not with the ones who are who are supposed to be pro-Russian. Italy, Giorgia Meloni, for example, extremely anti-migration, extremely anti-LGBT rights, creating laws. The European establishment is fine with them. Why? Because they're on the side of Ukraine when it comes to the conflict. So I think foreign policy is a much bigger determinant factor on this case than say migration or social conservatism. I don't think so. I think yes, there are various issues between the European establishment and the populist parties, but fundamentally they can work around those things as long as they know that one, they control all the judicial measures. Like if Giorgia Meloni goes to war with the European Union on when it comes to LGBT rights, it's going to go to a European court and Meloni is going to lose. So they have the confidence that they can tackle all the right, populist European parties when it comes to migration or social conservatism. On foreign policy, though, that is a matter of structural advantage. European Union has got no structural power to actually go to war. They have to depend on the local countries, and the local countries small countries can actually veto some of the measures about when it comes to foreign policy. So that is a much bigger threat, in my opinion. The second point that you mentioned about Germany and France, they're a little different in the sense like in Germany, the right populism is very localized. When I was in Munich, for example, in Bavaria, most of the people around them, the right wing, even the right wing populists, CSU is more populist than CDU, right? So when I was in Bavaria, I was talking to the local people, and they're like, "Yeah, we are opposed to migration. We are opposed to the Turks, for example, are very much Europeanized. They are very much into the system, whereas the Albanians are not. So we have got problems with the Albanians and the Ukrainians, and they're taking all the hogging all the benefits. But they're again going to vote for CSU for the 47th time in their life, for example. AFD, for example, is a very localized movement. People don't really seem to understand. They think that tomorrow AFD is just going to take over the entirety of Germany. I don't foresee that happening because it is fundamentally a very proto-Prussian kind of party, which is localized in the eastern parts of Germany, the former GDR, for example. In France, Marine Le Pen is an actual threat because in the French system, you run all the political parties first, and then you take the top two, and all the other political parties kind of side with each other, and then there's a general election that happens, and people vote. So, if Marine Le Pen tomorrow stands for an election, and if all the political parties then lose, and there is a conflict, there is a straightaway confrontation between the central establishment parties of Macron and Marine Le Pen's party, the general population might vote for Marine Le Pen, in which case France, being the second most powerful country, economic power in the European Union, will actually have a right populist party leading the election, which is not going to happen in Germany anytime in the future. So that is an actual threat in the politics of European Union. European Union's politics will change if France's establishment changes, and that is a threat that they cannot afford to, confront.
Yeah. I mean, one problem the National Rally has is in parliamentary elections, no matter how well they do, all of the other parties just kind of band together. And so you have this
Right.
absurd situation of like Macron's technocratic neoliberal party going into a coalition with like these far left socialists, because France actually has like real, actual, communists in the mix. And then in the presidential elections, Le Pen can get to the runoff. She can do really well in the first round, get a plurality, get to the runoff, and then a similar thing happens where all the other parties kind of implore their voters to vote whoever the alternative is.
Yep.
But Jared, do you want to say any more about Le Pen, the situation?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how this is all gonna play out. Again, it mirrors what happened in the United States. It's interesting to see the same playbook going again, that this seems to be the go-to strategy of the sort of, liberal technocratic establishment. Totally, I think, backfire in the US, and now you have the major vibe shift taking place in the United States where it looked particularly bad, but, France is not the United States, and the EU certainly is not, and so I wouldn't be shocked if this again thwarts her potential rise to power. But then again, maybe this is the moment. Maybe this is the moment that Le Pen finally gets into power in France after so long. All it took was being threatened with arrest.
Yeah, I think there's a chance it could be a blessing in disguise if it just makes the National Rally look like this oppressed party. And then Le Pen is kept out, but then Bardella, who is a very he's a very engaging, charismatic figure. Like if I was some centrist, technocratic person in France, I would be really worried about that guy. He's like a star on social media. If he was heading the ticket, and he's allowed to, like as a 29-year-old or however old he'll be, 31. He's allowed to run for president, and I think he could. I think he might stand a better chance than Le Pen because maybe people are a little weary of Le Pen after all these years.
And this projects a weakness too. I mean, that you have to just ban basically and arrest your opponents. I mean, how does that look? You ultimately look strong. I guess you look strong if you can pull it off. But I don't think, given how these systems work, that really looks like strength. It looks like, well, you're losing, you try to change the outcome. And I think that people see that very naturally. So this doesn't make it seem like the EU or France are particularly strong at this moment, or that the populist waves are going to die down. If anything, it looks like they can't control it. It's getting out of their control. So that's, to me, what that projects, at least from my American perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have to move on now to the Russia Ukraine war, and specifically this very long New York Times article published this week entitled The Partnership: The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. The subheadline says, "This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies." And that sums up the piece pretty well, although I would quibble with the idea that the story has been untold up to now. I mean, the basic contours of the story were already well known if you were paying attention, but the New York Times did fill in some pretty interesting details. So basically, the US and its coalition partners were not only providing weapons, but providing targeting information, basically saying there are Russian invaders at this location, or there's Russian material at that location, and you should fire on them at this time. NATO leaders were meeting in Germany with Ukrainian commanders, talking strategy and tactics. They were training the Ukrainians. They were doing everything except sending soldiers and pulling the trigger. One European intelligence chief said he had been taken aback to learn how enmeshed in the Ukraine war NATO had become, and he told the Times, quote, I have the quote here, "They are part of the kill chain now." Sumantra, what was your reaction to this piece?
Yeah, my reaction is like European intelligence is a paradoxical, question. Like they're not. I mean, if their intelligence doesn't really know what they're doing, then I mean that's a sure sign of decline. Look, you're right. This was nothing new. Pretty much everything that has been said there, like target coordination, giving them weapons, giving them targets, helping them with satellites, helping them with data tracking, missile direction, all of these things were being done essentially by us because one, the Ukrainians are not trained to do that. Two, the Ukrainians don't have the capable systems and weaponry we have, and we have used that. We, in the sense, the British and the Americans. Finally, those are the two countries that has been constantly mentioned in this essay that you mentioned. And three, it's quite obvious that who is providing the intelligence. Like, I mean, the whole essay I read, and there were like two different tones that were coming in. On one hand, is one of incompetence, where a lot of American, bureaucrats are complaining, "Oh, look, we trusted the Ukrainians, and now the Ukrainians are not listening to us." Well, what does that say of you? You're the ones who are providing materials and weapons and platforms and money, and you can't control your dog on a leash. That doesn't really talk. I mean, speaking of an empire, that's one of the stupidest imperialism that I've seen. The second thing is one of where they are saying that, look, I mean, the Ukrainians are not listening to us because the Ukrainians have their own idea of, difference of interest, which is absolutely valid. The Ukrainians are fighting for their country, and it's quite obvious that they have a difference of interest with the United States. The United States' interest is not to be in a nuclear war with a peer rival. Ukraine's interest is to get the United States enmeshed in that conflict. It's not just different, it's absolutely opposed to each other. And that is something which would have got you out for disinformation on Twitter 3 years back, when some of us were actually saying that, look, this is a proxy war that is going on. We are being taken for suckers because the Ukrainians are trying to drag us. You guys will remember, I think it was like 2 years back, when this missile hit Poland. And for 3 days, everyone was like, look, we can see that it's a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile. We have the fragments, which are made of material, which are classical of Ukrainian aircraft missiles. And we could actually track the flight path of the missiles because we have got better and superior satellites. And the Ukrainians and Zelensky were like just coming on TV, like, no, it's actually a Russian missile, which Poland, bring on Article 5. You're just going to, bring NATO to war. It's quite obvious what their intention is. We all understand that. The fact that it's coming out as something which is a huge thing in New York Times and everyone is just like acting surprised is, to me, the most surprising thing, because anyone with even a cursory understanding of how target tracking happens would be able to say that this got nothing to do with Ukraine. It is fundamentally us getting involved. By the way, according to international law, if you provide target coordination against a peer rival, that makes you a co-belligerent, we are technically a co-belligerent in a conflict with Russia. If the Russians had their version of NATO, that would have been an Article 5 situation where they could say, like, look, these countries are providing. What would we do? How do we classify Iran, for example, providing targeting to Iranian proxies in the Middle East? Is the exact same thing that we are doing. And if we say that Iranians are the ones responsible for their proxies hitting us, the Russians are absolutely, right to say that fundamentally the Ukrainians don't really matter because they are just American proxies. It's a war between NATO and Russia. We are already in a war, and we're just gonna, not. It makes our situation and our, uh, attempt to have a better relation with Russia extremely difficult, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. Jarrett, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. The piece itself, what I think was a very pro-Pentagon kind of perspective in general. The Ukrainian generals, they're always making mistakes, and we know exactly where to target. That was the sort of impression, but I had the same impression you did, Sumantra. It's like, well, it's ultimately our decisions that are driving this. I mean, one of the Ukrainian generals, I think it was, made some comment like, "Well, we know why we're here fighting for our country, and the U.S. is replaying a Cold War drama from the past," which I thought was very interesting line from this. Like they know very clearly what they're trying to do with this. They would much prefer a broader war than just the kind of regional one that they're currently participating in. They'd want to draw on the United States. It seems like a lot of the decisions that we're making, yes, they're military decisions, but the larger strategic decisions seem to be missing. And especially when there were a few eye-popping things in this. One of the intelligence estimates saying that, well, at some point during the war, they thought there was maybe a 50-50 chance that this could go nuclear. Now, given I don't necessarily trust U.S. Intelligence assets to get this right, but they were obviously flirting with something much bigger. And, it's like, many conflicts in history sleepwalking into it. All in this case, it was just a hot action that we were participating in. What was the end goal here ultimately? I mean, was it to simply keep this war going and keep the Russians bogged down in a war of attrition that fighting against a weaker opponent that they'll ultimately win? Was that really the grand strategy that they've cooked up at the Pentagon and in the White House for some kind of larger victory for the United States and our larger strategic goals? It seems like, yes, there was a lot of military coordination. Obviously, the U.S. is still capable of some very impressive things militarily, but it seemed detached from any kind of larger strategic thinking other than just let's get in a war with Russia and keep this meat grinder going, which I don't think is in the interest of the United States. I think it's ultimately sort of sold out some of our allies there in Ukraine, and I understand they're going to keep fighting this war. I mean, look, the pro-war parties are very popular in Ukraine. Things might change if the U.S. was not involved at all, and that may change actually quite dramatically. There's a reason why I'm not sure how long Zelensky would last if the U.S. actually did disengage, which maybe is why he wants to draw out these negotiations as long as possible. But I just kind of got a bad impression of what our policies were during the Biden era at the end of the day. What was the end goal here in Ukraine? Were we to keep this war going on forever? So yeah, for me, there wasn't anything truly surprising. I think the details of the level of cooperation, I think many were paying attention, sort of knew beforehand. But it is pretty surprising to see the administration take us so close to war with a very powerful Russia, and how much they were willing to do without a larger strategic set of goals, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, that 50% chance of Russia detonating a nuclear weapon, that originally came from Bob Woodward's most recent book. And, I'm sure that's an overestimate, but it does seem to have been the estimate of the Biden administration at one point in time, which is pretty interesting. Jake Sullivan said, well, looking at all the intelligence, it seems like there's a 50% chance they're going to use a nuke. And, Biden got so much credit for his escalation management. But even after coming to that very frightening determination, we can see now in the New York Times report just how involved they were. I mean, it does put all this stuff together pretty nicely, even though, nothing was really that new to me except for some details. Um, Jarrett, you mentioned that this was kind of a pro Pentagon report, and I agree with that. I also thought it was a pro Biden administration report, and maybe that sounds obvious, but the reporters involved in the story, it says that they interviewed over 300 people, 300 officials. It seems like mostly U.S. military officials, and then secondarily British and Ukrainian military officials, and then some other Europeans. Um, And my sense was that a lot of the people that they were talking to were basically trying to mount a defense of the Biden administration's policies. They wanted to leave people with the opposite impression of the one that you said you had, Jared, where you were just thinking, what the heck was the Biden administration doing? This is crazy. They really wanted to leave the impression that Biden was handling this well, that Lloyd Austin was just this like heroic figure who is very stable and reliable and he knows what he's doing. And I think they also wanted to make it seem like the Ukrainians really screwed this up. It's kind of a scapegoating article. Like that's the subtext. Like Ukraine, just they're these wily actors. They had way too ambitious goals. We're always telling them what they should do right, and they just screw it up. And we're giving them the most amazing intelligence known to man, where they can target Russian, Russian invaders like very specifically, thanks to us. And they just keep on screwing up, and that's why they lost. I mean, maybe that's putting it a little too strongly, but to me, that seemed like the general vibe of the report, which I found kind of annoying. Like, I really feel for the Ukrainians right now. As Mearsheimer said, we led them down the primrose path. They got wrecked, as he predicted, and now we're seeing this process of kind of scapegoating them. But I don't know if you guys agree with that
I I
assessment.
I do agree with it, and I found it interesting that somebody missing also for it was Biden. Like, what were his decisions and thought process throughout this? Like, that should be the most important opinion, is that the man who is the president of the United States is almost entirely missing from this article. It's defending his administration, their choices, but he is silent throughout this, which I think is quite interesting. And I agree with you. I actually kind of felt sort of compassion for the Ukrainians through this. I mean, yeah, maybe they did, and I do think that their decision to attack Kursk was obviously a major disaster, but, they were sort of micromanaged to this war, that the Biden administration obviously was in charge of this, and now they're trying to say, "No, you know what? We did our best for democracy. If only it was, if only they had listened, to us, then we would have won. We were so close to winning. We were so close to winning. If that offensive in 2023 had panned out, everything would have gone our way." And that was I think the impression that they tried to create. I don't buy it for my reading of this, but I do think you're right that that was the impression that this article tried to portray. Despite the fact that it does look like, when you look at the assessment at the end of it, it doesn't look good for the future of this conflict, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, they kind of want to imply that that's Trump's fault too. I think like Trump came in and kind of ruined this policy. Sumantra, any last words on Russia Ukraine?
No, I think you guys are right. I mean, I feel terrible for the Ukrainians. Like there was this one part where we were talking about in that essay they were talking about how the Ukrainians decided that they're gonna just continue fighting in Bakhmut and that they were gonna continue fighting. And I'm thinking like, look, you're there is you cannot expect a Soviet style army to have a very American style warfare because they're just not trained to do that. They don't have the combined arms operation like that you should have. They don't have the air force that is needed for to create a kind of Iraq war kind of situation where the American forces went after everything was just essentially flattened. They don't have that. None of those things have, and that's absolutely right. We don't want to give them those weapons because then we can't control them if they go and bomb Russia. Like, again, the fundamental thing in this equation is there is an asymmetry of interest. Our interests with Russia vis-a-vis Russia are not the same as Ukrainian interests vis-a-vis Russia. The easiest way that could have been achieved is what Mark Milley talked about is when he said that, look, you guys are winning, just go and have a deal with the Russians and say like we want to stop the war and we want to go for it. But then it was the Biden administration which scapegoated Mark Milley. This was an internal conflict which was being played out within the administration of this country. It's got nothing to do with the Ukrainians. Like I totally agree with you, Andrew. Like the entire tone of the article was like, look, we were surprised by what the Ukrainians did, and it shouldn't have happened. And I'm thinking, well, that is your incompetence. One, if you to like if we can take the best interpretation of that, that is fundamentally your incompetence. That is the best interpretation. Like you didn't understand what the Ukrainians were doing. If the worst interpretation is taken, you're trying to now scapegoat the Ukrainians because of your own problems in your administration. None of that make the last administration look good, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think Mark Milley was the only person talking sense in the Biden administration, to be honest. Like during that counteroffensive, when that was successful, he was saying clearly, and he was clearly trying to get it,
Yeah,
not just behind closed doors. Like he wanted the media to know that he thought, no, we should stop now because it's only going to get worse from here. And they might actually have a chance to get some sort of settlement that somewhat favors the Ukrainians. And
that's
then
right.
Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who are barely mentioned in this article, they're the ones who pushed back against that. And they're the ones who really screwed this all up.
It got
Jared, I'll
like
give you the
one
last.
Yeah, it
Go
got like
ahead.
one line, Billy's line, like that decision, maybe we now should look for peace essentially. And that got like one line. This entire 30,000 word essay that got one line and no further discussion. It's like, yeah, maybe they should. It's like Millie was actually the one speaking some sense in this situation. Like, well, now that we've actually had some success, now it's time to call it quits here because it's obviously not working, but they just went ahead anyway. There's very little discussion of that in the article. It's just one line that was dropped in and then it continues, which to me, it's like, wow, that was actually one moment where maybe this could have actually been stopped and the larger disaster could have been prevented. But that obviously didn't happen because of the decisions that the previous administration made, and that's pretty clear.
Yeah, Milley's only the top general in the American military. I mean, what does he know? We got to listen to Blinken. Yeah, it's totally frustrating. We don't have a lot of time. I do want to move on to our final topic, Panama. So, Jarrett, what's going on with the Panama Canal? Take us back to the beginning. I mean, I don't mean like to the construction of the canal necessarily, but to Trump's plans for it and what's been going on
Yeah,
recently.
I think this is very interesting because the Panama Canal was like one of the very first things that Trump did, even just before he got into the White House, was talk about the Panama Canal and the Chinese influence there, which I do think is a big deal. I think it's part of his shift toward a sort of Western Hemisphere or America's doorstep kind of policy, but also directed toward China and the growth of China. We talked about how Panama was being taken over by the Chinese and actually kind of got mocked both by some of the media and some of Panama saying, no, no, there's no, overwhelming Chinese influence here. But the truth is actually, uh, in Panama, there is quite a bit of Chinese influence, including the ports that lead to the canal itself, which is owned by a Hong Kong based company by the name of CK Hutchinson that recently went through with a deal with BlackRock and a consortium of American countries companies to essentially sell their stake and not just those ports of the Panama Canal, but 43 ports globally, which was a very big deal. It wasn't just about the Panama Canal; it's about something very much bigger. Which I was honestly a little surprised at the time that this kind of deal was even allowed under the Chinese authority. But recently, the Chinese actually nixed the deal. They've decided to basically whack CK Hutchinson, which I find that very interesting that this Hong Kong company was willing to stand up to the regime there, especially because it does have enormous geopolitical implications. I mean, it's not just the Panama Canal, which is incredibly important to strategy in the Western Pacific, the Pacific as a whole, the global economy, but these ports around the world, which China has tried to dominate, essentially. So it does strike me that the Trump administration was onto something when they pursued this policy to sort of retake some amount of control over the Panama Canal, which is essential not just for U.S. economy, but for our national security, certainly in the Pacific. If anything goes down in the Pacific, that'll be vital. I think it's pretty clear when you look at a map why it is so. Um, but I do find this interesting. Of course, the next steps will be also be interesting. How does Panama respond to the fact that China has shut down this deal? How does the U.S. respond? I know Trump and Xi Jinping will be meeting in the next few months. So it'll be interesting to see what happens at the end of those deals. But I think this goes to sort of the Trump administration's larger strategy, which I hope is to pivot toward China and Asia than what we have been in the last since the end of the Cold War, which is absolutely vital. It's very clear that China has larger ambitions and has made enormous inroads sort of under the noses of the American establishment. And I do hope the Trump administration is able to continue this. I mean, there are live distractions now happening across the globe that take away from that, but China represents an economic rival the likes of which the United States has never seen since it became a great power. Taking it seriously in places like the Panama Canal or in the Arctic and other places is incredibly vital to our future. This is right on our doorstep. This is not some place in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe. This is right here and involves direct U.S. interests. So I think it's very important that Trump sort of started this debate over Panama, and I hope that continues with this administration.
Interesting. Well, thanks for that update. That was super informative. So thanks for that. We're coming up on an hour, so I think I'm going to stop it here. I want to thank our listeners on podcast apps and our viewers on YouTube for sticking with us to the end. I want to thank you, Sumantra, and especially you, Jarrett, for joining us today. It was good talking to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.